Hello, my name is Nicholas Diak. I'm an independent scholar and co-founder and co-chair of the AnnRadCon Academic Conference. Today I'll be giving a presentation titled Strange Realities, Twilight Zone-sploitation and Encounter with the Unknown.
This bridge is to accept all kinds of possibilities, especially the most exciting possibility of all, the possibility of impossibility.
Now, these are the words of Rod Serling, creator and presenter of the influential television program, The Twilight Zone. Though the statement sounds like it was lifted from the television series, one would be hard-pressed to determine from which episode. And that's because the dialogue is from Encounter with the Unknown, a curious entry in Serling's filmography. Late in his career, when he was doing voice work, The Twilight Zone left an enduring legacy, inspiring and influencing numerous other programs and becoming a pop culture phenomenon. Encounter is such a post-Twilight Zone film that greatly exhibits the series' influence. However, unlike shows like The Outer Limits, which sought to capitalize on the Twilight Zone formula, Encounter went even further in its emulation by employing Serling to provide narrations in his recognizable style, recreating that distinctive Twilight Zone vibe. Now, this presentation posits that Encounter of the Unknown, by leveraging distinctive and iconic attributes of the Twilight Zone, becomes both a multiplicity and an exploitation film derivative of the original Twilight Zone. After an extremely condensed plot synopsis of Encounter, along with text of Serling's narrations, this presentation will define what exploitation films are, what multiplicities are, and how they allow Encounter to continue the textual tradition of the original show. Afterwards, it will be demonstrated precisely how Encounter exploits the Twilight Zone through emulation of the oral and textual aspects of Serling's narrations and repurposing the show's iconic imagery onto the home releases of the film. Now, Encounter of the Unknown is an anthology film divided into 3 stories, similar in structure to episodes of Serling's own Night Gallery. An unknown and uncredited non-Serling narrator opens the film by referencing studies of unusual deaths all being interred in the same cemeteries. The first story opens with a funeral procession, with Serling ominously setting the mood.
There are few things as strange as reality, for reality comes to us wearing many faces, disguised as all manner of things. What is reality and what is illusion? Some things we think are real may be merely wisps of smoke from our minds. And some things we think illusion are really cloaked in that guise, so they may play their parts without knowing what they really are.
Once the procession stops, Serling proceeds to the story's introduction proper.
Did these events happen by coincidence or by an unknown and unknowable calculation? Let's start by populating this day's stage with some of the characters. Dave Terrell, Frank Kemper, Randy Powell. 3 young men, college students, all the boy next door, all people we've known before. Brother Taylor, a well-meaning and God-fearing man. Johnny Davis, the one who holds the rather dubious place of honor at this gathering. And this is Camille Davis, Johnny's mother, the 7th daughter of the 7th son. Does she have anything to do with our story? Perhaps. Let's unfold it.
Now, the story is about 3 friends, Dave, Frank, and Randy, who play a prank on their friend Johnny. He dies. Johnny's mother, Camille, curses the trio that every 7 days, one of them will die. They do. And Serling closes out the story.
So Randy Powell went skydiving. What was it that woman named Camille said? 1 by land and 2 by air. Didn't Frank say that he found a heptagon to be a 7-sided figure? And didn't Dave die 7 days after Johnny's funeral, and Frank 14 days after? What is the reality, and what is the illusion? Our story doesn't tell us. But I wonder if Randy knows that it's 21st day.
Now, the second story begins with verdant shots of trees and ponds while a boy and his pet dog frolic around. Serling opens with,
It is tradition that ghosts and ghouls criminals and various other citizens of the grotesque wrap themselves in malevolent mists and deep darkness. Horror is a condition existing most often when morning seems farthest away. So it would seem unlikely that this bright spring day in 1906 would begin a horror that to this day haunts a small community in southern Missouri. A boy and his dog chase dreams and butterflies back and forth across Saturday. Observe one man-child and one man-child's dog on their way to a uniquely soul-shattering rendezvous with darkness. A terrifying encounter with the unknown.
Now, this story concerns a deep, mysterious hole outside the town that the boy's dog fell into. The townsfolk investigate. The boy's father, Joe, volunteers to be roped to go down into the hole. He lets out a scream, he's pulled out, and then he runs around mad and insane. Serling closes the story by revealing the fate of Joe.
No one knows what happened down in that cave. Joe was a strong, intelligent man who had lived his entire life close to the earth. Never before had he intruded upon the affairs of that godless society that dwells deep within the bowels of the earth. But he did leave him. After a manner of speaking, somehow through this wild experience he had lost his mind. He was insane, and spent the rest of his life in a state insane asylum.
The third and final story is a folk ghost story about a girl who doesn't know she's dead. Serling opens with,
"There is a bridge in our mind that leads through time and memory from what we know to shores beyond knowing. It sways high and darkly dangerous above the canyons of our disbelief, like some spectral span spun by devils for us to tread. To walk this bridge is to accept all kinds of possibilities, especially the most exciting possibility of all, the possibility of impossibility. Some tales of the impossible so capture the imagination that they quickly spread over much of the country. The Girl on the Bridge is such a tale. Countless variations of this story are told and retold. In North Carolina, it is the Lydia story. In Illinois, it's the Spectre of the Mists. And in Texas, it's called the White Rock Lady. Dozens of interviews and hours of newspaper research trace the story's origin and consequent spread across the country, from central Arkansas, beginning in 1929. Come now and explore the possibility of the impossible. Come stand beside the girl on the bridge."
Now, Ghost Girl Susan is spotted by a senator as she waits on a bridge. She wants to go home. He takes her home. Her father says she died a long time ago. The senator returns to his car and the girl has vanished. The story ends with Susan's ghost back at the bridge while Serling's narration closes out the tale.
It has been said that our lives are merely bridges through time. But what of death? We know where death begins. But across what does it span? Where does it lead? These are questions Susan could easily answer if we could but find her. And this too is possible. For dozens of people, including the senator, say she still stands above the bridge waiting, perhaps for you, to pass her way once more.
From the last house on the left to Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to The Exterminator, exploitation and grindhouse films play an important counterpart to Hollywood and mainstream cinema. Exploitation cinema is a realm of gory horror films, sleazy erotic imports, low-budget genre fare, and ambitious independent filmmakers operating outside the traditional industry structures. In Nightmare USA, Stephen Thrower dives deep into the realm of exploitation cinema and defines such films as, quote, independently made non-studio films produced either to A, exploit the financial possibilities of a popular genre, B, respond quickly to current interest in a contemporary topic, or C, to milk an existing market success. With this definition in mind, Encounter can be classified as an exploitation film because it meets each of the criteria proffered by Thrower. It situates itself within the horror anthology genre, it takes advantage of pop culture interest in the occult and paranormal, and it attempts to capitalize on the success of The Twilight Zone. Genre-wise, Encounter is a horror film, though it lacks the blood, gore, and sex that saturated the exploitation films of the period. However, in regard to specifying a genre formula that the film unabashedly apes, Encounter is a horror anthology film, a niche genre made up of shorter horror films, oftentimes linked to themes or characters. The horror anthology format has seen periodic cycles of success. Examples of anthologies that were released in the 1960s before Encounter of the Unknown include Twice Told Tales, Black Sabbath, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, and Torture Garden. Encounter of the Unknown is an early 1970s entry in the genre, subsequently followed by the infamous Trilogy of Terror, as well as Dead of Night and The House of the Dead. Encounter, along with these other films, helped usher in a renaissance of horror anthology films in the 80s that include Creepshow and its 1987 sequel, the Twilight Zone film, Nightmares, Dead Time Stories, and many, many more. The second point of Thrower's definition is that an exploitation film is often produced in response to a contemporary trend. In the case of Encounter, this would be an interest in the occult, supernatural, paranormal, new age, extraterrestrial, and metaphysical topics that were occurring in the late 1960s through the 70s. This was a time period where Eric von Däniken's book Chariot of the Gods had just been turned into a commercially successful documentary, and Danbury Press published a 21-volume set of books called The Supernatural, which would pave the way for Time Life Books releasing a similar set of books called Mysteries of the Unknown in the 80s. The 1970s would see the broadcasting of the popular television series In Search Of, which featured Rod Serling narrating the first 3 episodes, In Search of Ancient Astronauts, In Search of Ancient Mysteries, and The Outer Space Connection. In regard to cinema, per Thrower, quote, swelling the ranks of the supernatural horror film, at least numerically, are those concerned with the occult. After the smash success of Rosemary's Baby and the even greater commercial and cultural impact of The Exorcist, tales of sorcery and Satanism were, if you will, legion, end quote. Interest in the occult and supernatural were certainly capitalized on by films such as Blood of Satan's Claw, Beyond the Door, and The Omen and its many sequels. Folk horror scholar Howard David Ingham notes the pervasiveness of the subject matter. Quote, there is something oddly prosaic about the way the occult was presented in the 70s. It always seemed close, part of the public realm, and crucially not the perverse of the privileged class, end quote. And, quote, occult, astrology, and spiritualism were not central in our culture, but their iconography was present enough in the 70s that they needed no introduction, and it infected our pop culture, end quote. All in all, the time period in which Encounter was released in was experiencing a surge of interest in these occult topics, and the film took advantage of this trend, and in the process wound up contributing as well. Finally, to Thrower's third point, Encounter fits the definition of an exploitation film because it attempts to cash in on the success of The Twilight Zone. In addition, Encounter can also be said to use the definition put forth by Amanda Ann Klein and R. Barton Palmer in Cycles, Sequels, Spin-offs, Remakes, and Reboots to be a multiplicity of The Twilight Zone. For Klein and Palmer, texts, i.e. films, are not self-contained entities, but are, quote, joined by various bonds to other texts, end quote, taken on forms such as, quote, adaptations, sequels, remakes, imitations, trilogies, reboots, series, spin-offs, and cycles, end quote. All these various forms of textual continuations and reimaginings can be folded up under the umbrella term of multiplicities. Multiplicities create a, quote, connection between texts, end quote, that, quote, afford the opportunity for complex forms of aesthetic enjoyment, end quote, allowing consumers to, quote, appreciate the new in the context of the familiar and already approved, sanctioning readings that crisscross textual borders, end quote. The existence of the successor texts also, quote, volatize the original by underlining its insufficiency, by announcing that there is more to the text that does not contain and likely does not anticipate, in the process revealing that there is a desire for continuation, a repetition that the original cannot satisfy, end quote. With this in mind, viewers of Encounter of the Unknown, new text, are able to find enjoyment because of the familiar elements the film lifts, exploits, from the Twilight Zone original, approved, sanctioned text, which in effect also creates the linkage between both texts. This linkage, essentially in the form of imitation, causes Encounter to become a multiplicity of the Twilight Zone. This puts Encounter in the same camp as the many Twilight Zone revivals and the '83 film, which are multiplicities because they are reboots and remakes of the original text. The sheer existence of Encounter also demonstrates that the original text of the Twilight Zone is still an open book, and that stories, ideas, concepts, and so on that were not present in the original can be found in the successor and derivative texts. So, how exactly does Encounter of the Unknown capitalize on the Twilight Zone and in the process become a multiplicity of the show? Two attributes of Encounter that accomplish this feat are mimicking Serling's Twilight Zone narrations and recreating the iconic Twilight Zone visual cues for the home video releases of the film. By the early 1970s, the Twilight Zone had been off the air for many years, yet Serling was still much in demand. This period saw the airing of Serling's successor series, Night Gallery, and what followed during and after this endeavor was a variety of audio work. Aside from Encounter, Serling lent his vocal talents to the previously mentioned In Search of episodes, the radio program 0 Hour, narrating the introduction to Brian De Palma's Phantom of the Paradise, narrating the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau, and many other programs. Undeniably, Serling's voice had currency. In his review of Encounter of the Unknown, Brett Gallman at Oh, the Horror stated, quote, "One can argue that Boris Karloff's booming, gravelly dialogue is just as distinctive as his often monstrous facial features. Likewise, who would mistake Lugosi's Hungarian accent or Price's velvety voice of any other? While Rod Serling's face may not have been as famous as these titans of horror, his voice arguably was just as recognizable," end quote. In her book, As I Knew Him, My Dad, Rod Serling, Anne Serling expounds, quote, "My father's voice had many different intonations and pitches. There is the tight, clipped Twilight Zone or Night Gallery host voice introducing that week's episode. There is his regular dad speaking voice. There is the voice he uses for PBS narrations or commercial spots. All of his different and funny dialects and accents. And finally, his playful voice," end quote. It is this iconic, tight-clipped hosting voice that Serling uses that puts him in the same pantheon as Karloff and Lugosi in Gallman's observation, and it is the same voice that Encounter channels in order to harness Serling's Twilight Zone marquee value. In addition to Serling's hosting voice, the text of Serling's narrations in Encounter of the Unknown draw heavily from the text of the narrations from The Twilight Zone, making similar similes and references. For example, in the opening narration to Encounter, Serling's narration asks, "What is reality and what is illusion?" Similar statements challenging the viewers to question the duality of reality are found in Twilight Zone episodes, such as Perchance the Dream.
They say a dream takes only a second or so. And yet in that second, a man can live a lifetime. He can suffer and die, and who's to say which is the greater reality? The one we know or the one in dreams? Between heaven, the sky, the earth, in the Twilight Zone.
And Shadow Play.
We know that a dream can be real. But whoever thought that reality could be a dream? We exist, of course, but how? In what way?
The matter-of-fact way characters are introduced in Encounter's first segment mimics similar introductions in One for Angels.
Man on the sidewalk named Lupo, age 60-ish, occupation, bitchman.
And Walking Distance.
Martin Sloan, age 36, occupation, vice president, ad agency, in charge of media.
In the introduction of the second story of Encounter, Serling's narration mentions idyllic scenes of a young boy playing with his dog and muses on the nature of the horror and the grotesque before mentioning how a small town becomes besieged with something horrible. These musings have parallels in It's a Good Life.
And you'll note that the people in Peaksville, Ohio have to smile. They have to think happy thoughts and say happy things because once displeased, the monster can wish them into a cornfield. Or change them into a grotesque walking horror.
And Third from the Sun.
Quitting time at the plant. Time for supper now. Time for families. Time for a cool drink on porch. Time for the quiet rustle of leaf-laden trees that screen out the moon. And underneath it all, behind the eyes of the men, hanging invisible over the summer night, is a horror without words.
The similarities in narrations between Encounter of the Unknown and the narrations from the Twilight Zone, all delivered in the same style of voice from Serling, is quite telling. If the audio narrations were divorced from their visual counterpart in Encounter, they would certainly be indistinguishable from those used in the Twilight Zone. Now, Serling's narrations, both oral and textual, were not the only aspect of the Twilight Zone that Encounter of the Unknown sought to capitalize on. Iconic visual imagery from the television show found its way into promotional aspects of the film in order to entice viewers, promising them a Twilight Zone experience. The home video market greatly leveraged as much Serling and Twilight Zone aspects as possible in order to promote the film. The first VHS release of Encounter was in 1988 by Interglobal Video Promotions Limited, a mere year after the original series of The Twilight Zone found new life through mail-order VHS releases by Columbia House. Perhaps in response to these Twilight Zone VHS tapes, but definitely capitalizing on the television show proper, the artwork on the Interglobal release contains a plethora of Serling Twilight Zone connections. Serling's head floats in the exact center of a cover art behind an open door, with a large key that is aimed at said door. Serling's disembodied head looks exactly as he did during his Twilight Zone years. The open door in the cover recalls the opening sequences of the last 2 seasons of the Twilight Zone, which depicts a floating opening door in space. The floating key aimed at the door is a visual representation of Serling's title sequence narration, where he states, quote, "You unlock this door with the key of imagination," end quote. The VHS box boasts, in a Twilightian fashion, "Is it real, or only an illusion? Rod Serling of the Twilight Zone is your guide." In essence, the box art of this release is both a reimagining and a capitalization of the iconic Season 4 and 5 openings of the original series. The exploitation elements are further compounded by the fact that the film's title in the VHS box is in a font that closely mimics the Twilight Zone's logo. Of note, the entire layout, font, and artwork of the Interglobal release of Encounter was reused verbatim for their VHS release of the aforementioned Serling narrated The Outer Space Connection. The VCI home video VHS release of Encounter also exploits Serling and the Twilight Zone elements, though not as brazenly as the Interglobal release. As with the Interglobal version, the VCI box art displays a floating Rod Serling head, though it is a picture of an older Serling that looks to be from the early 70s. The font of the film's title is the same as the Interglobal release, showing reuse and recycling of shared resources between 2 distributors and other companies. The background of the VCI release depicts a horizon at dusk. The top of the box is dark and slowly transitions to a dark red before terminating at a mountainous horizon, mimicking a sun that has just set. The visuals here bear resemblance to one of the Twilight Zone's commercial bumpers that was used by CBS during the series' original run. The bumper used images from Season 1's introduction superimposed over each other. A flat landscape of rocky outcroppings, a hard horizon of twinkling stars about, and the Twilight Zone logo in the center. The VCI cover attempts to make an overt connection between the film and the television series by stating, "Rod Serling takes you past the Twilight Zone into the Encounter of the Unknown." The covers of both VHS releases of Encounter reimagine and emulate many of the distinguishable images of the Twilight Zone. These visual components, combined with Serling's narrations that mimic his intros and outros in the Twilight Zone, come together in Encounter to create an overly exploitative and derivative film. So in conclusion, Encounter of the Unknown is an exploitation film that uses the horror anthology format to capitalize on both occult interests of the 70s by mimicking aspects of the Twilight Zone, specifically Rod Serling's narration and iconic imagery. In the process of doing so, it becomes a multiplicity of the series, more or less continuing down the same path that the Twilight Zone paved. Though the original series had ended nearly a decade prior, there is still demand for a Twilight Zone adjacent product. Per Klein and Palmer, quote, "Entertainment now includes the promise that pleasure does not have to end after the lights go up or the series finale airs. That limits can always be exceeded by what the immediate future will bring if only the viewer will return," end quote. Encounter of the Unknown stepped in to fulfill the audience's need of want for more Twilight Zone. The film was not as successful as it could have been, but regardless, it remains an intriguing entry in both the Twilight Zone canon and Rod Serling's filmography. Encounter demonstrates just how absolute the Twilight Zone was in its influence. not just at the mainstream level, but down into the realm of exploitation films as well.